Cheaper than our producer's underage sister. Edgier than the stuff shown on late night television. Newer than Kim Kardashian's ex. Live from Orlando, it's Crazy Train Radio.
This call is now being recorded.
Folks, host going solo the Croc again. Actually got an interesting interview here because coming up this weekend out in Waterloo, Iowa, this man is getting a Frank Gotch Award for the Lou Thesz Hall of Fame. Jumpin Jim Brunzell, you probably remember him either if you're an older fan from the AWA or most people remember him from the Killer Bees tag team. Jim, what's going on?
Adam, not much. It's been a real busy week. I'm looking forward to going down to Waterloo, and I've done, 2 or 3 different radio interviews, so it'll be fun. I'm going to see some of the guys, some old contemporaries of mine, and my wife and son are going to be down there, and some of my former teammates at the University of Minnesota, so hopefully it'll be a real nice event.
Nice. So when did you find out that they wanted to give you this award?
I got a call, and first of all, I thought it was a joke. And then this Kyle Klingman, who I think is, I believe he's a board member or he runs the museum, called me and told me that I was going to be inducted with the Frank Gotch Award. And first of all, I thought it was a rib. And then he went on, and then he explained to me, who was going to be inducted, and followed up with an email. And actually, I didn't believe him until I saw the email. So, that was, a couple, probably 3-4 months ago. So I was excited about it.
Well, obviously, we'll throw a little history out there real quick, Jim. For those who don't know, definitely got to do your research on Frank Gotch, who was a professional wrestler in America here of German ancestry, but he was also great with freestyle, but also popular as a professional wrestler as well. But anyway, Jim, to be given Frank's award is definitely a special honor for sure. And like you said, you definitely have some interesting classmates this year.
Yes. Well, I was real disappointed that Rick Flair is not going to be able to be there, or Bill Watts. And I don't know if many people know it, but Rick was in the same Vern Gagne-trained class that I was in 1972. We also had Kenny Patera and the Iron Schnook, Khosrow Vaziri.
And don't forget your tag team partner.
Yes, great guy. Myself.
Yes.
And then a former NFL linebacker from the Denver Broncos who was a great Minnesota athlete, Bob Ruggers, who wrestled for about 2 or 3 years, and then he was in that plane crash in Wilmington, I think it was Wilmington, South Carolina, and broke his back, and he didn't wrestle again. So, so it was, I was hoping to see Rick, and I know Rick's been through some real tough times with the loss of his son and some other problems. But, he's a screwball. He's a great guy. I love him. And, he is professional wrestling today.
Well, got to ask since you brought it up. And obviously we were disappointed to hear about the loss of a son-in-law. But back in camp and everything else throughout the years, was Rick always a screwball like that?
Well, he sort of was, if there was anybody who fit like a duck to water in this business of professional wrestling, it was Rick. He, as soon as we started, I knew that he was going to be a big star because he just could project himself, and he had this persona that, he just sort of lit up when he became the Nature Boy, and he left Minneapolis in late 1972, never came back, and he was down in Charlotte, and I went down to Charlotte for the Mid-Atlantic in 1979, and he was huge, and he lived that life, and you can spend, but sooner or later you're going to have to save, otherwise you're not going to have anything left. And Rick was the epitome of a great time. Everybody around him had a great time.
Well, Beans, and obviously the whole interview is not about Rick, but
yes,
since you mentioned about the saving and all, but best line I ever heard was retold to me recently that they heard from somebody of the generation or two before yours, Jackie Fargo, who we just lost.
Yes,
it's not.
I know Jackie. Yeah.
And Jackie would always tell some of the kids he worked with and brought into the business, "Hey kid, it's not how much money you spend or how much money you make; it's how much you save."
Exactly. I heard that too. And then I also heard Ray Stevens used to say, "I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a good time."
Yeah. So Ray Stevens was another character in himself, that's for sure.
Oh, he was. He was probably one of the greatest natural talents that I ever saw in the ring. And I remember he told me one time, he said, when he was first married, he told his wife he was going to go out for some bread. And he said he came back 2 weeks later. And she was still there.
Okay. And you know this guy well that I'll mention here, since you brought up Ray Stevens and funny Ray Stevens stories. Bobby Heenan.
Oh, incredible.
And I'll never forget that. Go ahead. Go ahead. I know you do.
Bobby, to me, people ask me, and if I have a little extra time in my acceptance speech, I'm going to mention this, that, people ask me who was the greatest guy I was ever in the ring with, and Bobby lives in Largo, Florida today, and he's, for the past 5 to 7 years, he had jaw cancer and mouth cancer, and is pretty deformed. He has no lower jaw. He can't talk. He's fed through his stomach. The worst thing about it is he can't talk, because here was a brilliant guy. Probably, if you put everything together, best timing, incredible heat getter, incredible manager, incredible interview. Bobby was the greatest. He was phenomenal in the ring. He delivered every night. The people loved to hate him, and it was a shame that now in his later years, thank God he's alive. And I email his wife Cindy a couple times a month to see how he's doing. And then actually, Adam, my mother-in-law lives in Port Charlotte, so we go down there a couple times a year, and I always go up to see him. And he's just a wonderful guy, and I just love him. I can't say enough good about him.
Yeah, Bobby was one of a kind. But going back to what I was going to tell you, the little story that he told me years ago, when I was talking to him at an event. And he brought up Ray Stevens. Somebody, there was probably 4 or 5 of us, just sitting around bullshitting. They were talking some of the old war stories at the backstage of the show. And Bobby says somebody asked Bobby about Ray Stevens. And he says, "Let me tell you about Ray. Ray is the type of guy that would tell you, would ask you, how old were you when you had your first lady? I don't know, I was 12. Wow, you're that young. What'd you guys do? I don't know, I was too drunk to remember."
That's the truth.
Yeah,
he was incredible. I remember one time he was up here and he was tagged with Nick Bockwinkel, and Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes were up here, and this was in the early 70s. Oh. And Dick and Dusty and Ray were out all night and something, and they had these damn what were they? They were sort of like road bikes, not road bikes, off the road bikes, dirt bikes. And Ray, somehow or other, they were drunk, and he got driving went around and he did something, and the damn thing came down on his calf, and the exhaust pipe burnt his leg. And I mean, burnt his leg bad. It was all blistered. And that son of a gun wrapped that leg up, and he worked 2 or 3 days in a row. And you know he was in pain, and I'm sure he took something for it, but he actually, the skin was peeling right off his lower calf, and he never said a word about it to anybody. Never complained or nothing.
Really. And,
Yeah,
you know, obviously some of the guys you've worked with, we could sit here telling stories about those guys, that generation, all day long. But let's actually bring this back into you a little bit.
Okay.
Obviously, like we mentioned earlier on when we were talking your early class there, with Flair and Gagne and Sheiky Baby and whatnot. You knew Greg through your college years, though I don't think you went to the same school. You were actually very well known for your high jump. Was what we read true that you actually jumped 6'7" in an unsanctioned meet?
Actually, it was a little higher. It was about 6'7.5", and I actually did it on my 4th attempt. And you're only allowed 3, but I wanted to do it. I wanted to try it one more time, and I made it. But I jumped 6'6", and I did the old-fashioned, which was a dive straddle. It wasn't the Fosbury flop. Dick Fosbury came around in 1968, and I had already been high jumping for a couple of years. So even though almost all the high jumpers today do, the Fosbury flop, I just was too tight, and to try to learn that at age, probably 18 or 19. When I got to college, I just thought, well, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, and I added weight for football. So my track coach over at the university told me I was the heaviest high jumper he ever coached. And I weighed about 215 then.
Well, how much, for someone who jumped for years, both in high school and college, like you said, you put on some weight for that and all, how difficult was the change with being a little heavier and whatnot over time there with your jumping?
You know what? The only thing that I knew that it affected me was it put an awful lot of pressure on your patella tendon down by your knee. Over your knee there, they have the patella tendon, and my takeoff foot, which was my left foot, you'd plant that heel and then you'd rock up and you'd just push as hard as you could. And I remember I had to have, I think my sophomore and junior year in track at the university, I had to have cortisone shots because that patella tendon flared up on me, and it was a result of just being too heavy. When I was in high school, I weighed 180 pounds, so it's, you put on 30 pounds, and that's going to make a little difference in your jump. Although my vertical jump lift increased about 3.5 inches in college, so the strength and the weight, was good there.
Yes, that's true. Well, what led you to actually look into going into Vern Gagne's camp? Which also, for many people who don't know, that's obviously they're familiar with the AWA and Vern's training camps, and you can correct me on this, but is it true that Vern's camps actually weren't every year? They'd be like every 3 or 4 years that he would bring a group in?
I think there was a couple years layoff after ours, and then Rick Steamboat came in there, and Buck Zumhoff was in there, and then they had a couple other guys, and he didn't have one every year, but it was actually what happened was Greg and I were freshman walk-ons at the University of Minnesota for the football team, and Greg was a quarterback, and I was a wide receiver, and we did extremely well together. As when I was on his team, and he would be passing the ball, and we were clipping down the field, making good gains. So we became good friends. Our sophomore year, they moved him from quarterback to defensive back, and Greg only weighed about 165, 170 pounds. And at that time, the Big Ten was a run offense conference, and I mean, you had 210, 220 pound, 230 pound running backs come flying around the end, and Greg would have to come up, and so Greg wanted to play quarterback. So after his sophomore year, he transferred to Wyoming. So I sort of lost track of him. I stayed at university, completed it. After my senior year at the university, I didn't get drafted or anything. I went and played semi-pro football in the fall of 1971 in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, with a team called the Manitowoc Chiefs. And they had about 4 or 5 teams, and it was a semi-pro league, and there was a lot of kids that were from college, and there was some guys that had 1 or 2 years NFL experience, and it was sort of fun. They moved me from split end to tight end there, and from there I got an invitation to a Washington Redskin tryout camp. So I went down there the following spring and went down there for 3 days. Didn't make it. I was actually too slow for a wide receiver and probably too small for a tight end. So I came back home, went back to school, and then Greg had called me because Ken Patera was just coming back from the Olympics, the Summer Olympics in Munich, and his dad was going to have a wrestling camp, and he was going to have Khosrow Vaziri, who was the Iranian, freestyle, Greco-Roman, champion, and then Bob Bruggers, the ex-football player, and then Ric Flair. So he just asked me if I had any interest, and I thought, well, I probably won't get another chance to play football. I've got nothing else going other than, I got 30 credits left to graduate from the College of Education. So I thought, well, I'll try it. So, we started that late fall. I think it was late September, early October. And it was 6 days a week, 6 to 7 hours a day. And Billy Robinson, beat the shit out of us every day. And then at the end of the day, Vern would come there after we'd been there for 4 hours and then jump on us and tie us all in knots. So that went on for 6 or 7 weeks, and then finally I had my first match, and it was December 27th, 1972, and it was in Moorhead, Minnesota, and I was scheduled to wrestle a guy named Dennis Stamp, who was trained by Vern about 2 or 3 years earlier, and we wrestled in Moorhead, and we had a 15-minute draw, and I was so tired. I came out of there, and I was very disappointed in my first match, and I remember coming into the locker room, and, I was immature, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I kicked the doggone garbage can, and Dusty Rhodes came up to me, and he said, Jimmy, just relax. He says, you got a long career ahead of you. And that was it.
Coming from Dusty, that means something, so.
Yeah. Well, he was a character, too.
Well, again, he's one of those guys you could sit there all day telling Dusty stories, but.
Yes, yeah.
But you mentioned a guy there with your first match, Dennis Stamp, which most people would actually remember, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what side of the fence you lay, would remember him from Beyond the Mat, being a friend of Terry Funk's. But, Dennis, how good in the ring was he actually, would you say?
Well, it was just my first time, and I was green as hell. And, I'm sure that he was, very, adept in the ring. Plus, he had such a great amateur background, and, he'd got that Texas style. Everybody who went to Texas and were around the Funks all had adopted a little mannerisms, of, whether it would be Dickie Slater or Bob Orton Jr., all those guys, and Terry Funk was another incredible individual, I mean, all those guys were such big influence on all the guys that started in the 70s, Dickie Slater and myself and Bob Orton Jr. and not so much Greg, because Greg Gagne, sort of patterned himself after his dad pretty much, but and Jack Briscoe and Jerry Briscoe. I mean, there was a lot of young talent that came around early, and you sort of would pick a little bit of their style and sort of add it to your repertoire.
Well, let's jump up a little bit here to where you start tagging the first time with Greg Gagne, and you end up winning the titles in AWA against Lanza and Duncan. What can you say? Who was actually managed, if I remember correctly, a guy we mentioned earlier, Bobby Heenan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was okay. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You run with
it. It was, actually. Greg and I had wrestled Bockwinkel and Stevens when they were champions, and then they lost the belts. I can't remember what happened, but then Duncombe and Lanza won it, and then Greg and I had a little feud with them, and anybody that was managed by Bobby at the time had a lot of heat on him, and Bobby Duncombe was very good in the ring. Jack Lanza had good timing. Jack Lanza was sort of a Texas-type interview. And, the great thing about the AWA, Adam, was that there was about 10 to 12, maybe 14 guys there. And I've said this so many times, when you first start, and you start in probably the best territory you could possibly be in, because there was only 12, or 14 guys, everybody knew their position, everybody made good money, and you didn't work every single day. You only worked 4 times a week. So you had 2 or 3 days off so you could enjoy yourself, you could enjoy your family, and this wasn't the case in New York. In New York, and I'm jumping ahead right now, but when I went to New York in '85, Brian Blair and we wrestled 27 days a month for 3.5 years straight. I mean, people didn't realize that Vince had 60 guys, and he ran 3 towns a night, 20 guys in each town, and he just put it was like they took a automatic gun and shot every doggone city in the United States, because we went, you get 2 weeks of plane tickets, and you might start off in L.A., and then you go to Houston, and then you'd go from Houston all the way up to Vancouver, and Vancouver to Washington, and Washington to Spokane, and then you'd work your way down L.A., and then you'd wind up down in Louisiana and down in Florida, then back in New York. I mean, it was hard to remember where the hell you were the night before.
Yeah, well, that's the thing we heard about that time period working in New York, that there wasn't any consistency as far as where you went schedule-wise.
No, there wasn't. And Vince, where, before when I started, there was like 23, 24 different promotions throughout the country. And when Vince started, sucking up the talent in '82 after Hulk left the AWA, and then so many guys, got, more or less they thought, well, hey, if I'm going to be in wrestling, I'm going to go for Vince, because nobody can compete with his TV. So pretty soon there was no place to go. And Vince had completely different philosophy of wrestling than the old-time wrestling promoters like Vern and, Bob Geigel and Watts and Eddie Graham. They had the good and the bad, but they more or less tried to legitimize, wrestling as far as a contest, where Vince didn't give a rat's ass about that. All he cared about was projecting a superstar that he could glean money from in royalties and residuals for, souvenirs. And that's basically what Vince created. There was no rhyme or reason to a match. Like Hulk might be out in California one night, and he'll wrestle, Paul Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful, and the finish of the match won't mean anything. So instead of building that, town for the next time they come there, Hulk might not come there again for 2 months. So there wasn't any what would continuity. And I'm sure you guys have talked about that in terms of, promotion and et cetera, and building an audience to keep coming back for either a crescendo, whether it be a championship match or a cage match or a strap match or something like that. Something of a blow-off where, at the end of that, well, then something new was going to start. So Vince didn't believe in any of that.
Well, obviously you mentioned him a couple of times here because of being in the AWA and going to work for Vince. What kind of relationship did you have with Hulk?
Hulk and I remember when Terry came to Minneapolis, he and I were good friends. I'll never forget, I invited him over. He came here in sort of late fall, and he set this territory on fire. I mean, they brought him in as a heel, and the people loved him. I mean, he was beating two guys on TV. He drew incredible houses, record houses for like 12, 13 months. And I think it sort of bothered Vern's ego that people, who were accustomed to Vern being the all-American, athletic type guy, drawing these big crowds, and all of a sudden you have a big blonde musclehead, who was, athletic. Hulk was very athletic, drew incredible houses. I mean, he was just, the people just loved him, and he and I'll never forget, I invited him over to my house. It was cold as hell. My son was only about 2 years old, so I was making, we were going to have steak and shrimp. So Hulk was downstairs with my little son, Jim, and I brought down some, I think it was chips and some sort of little cubes of cheese. So I was upstairs cooking everything, and I came downstairs, and I said to Hulk, how's it going? And my little son, Jimmy, had put so many cubes of cheese in Hulk's mouth. Hulk said to me, tell your son I don't want any more cheese, and his whole mouth was full of these little cheese cubes, but he couldn't say to Jimmy, that's it, he didn't want to say no. So that was the first time, and then after Hulk left, it was so cold that night when he couldn't get he had this old Lincoln, I can't remember what year it was, but it was probably a 69 or, no, it was later than that, it was probably a 75. And he couldn't get the dang thing shifted, so he had it in park, and he really jerked it, and he got it in low, and he couldn't get out of low gear, so he had to drive from White Bear to Bloomington, which is about 30 miles at about 30 miles an hour. So, nice. Yeah, but and then things changed when he went to New York. He had a lot of pressure on him, and everybody wanted, Vince, he did this, he did that. He was just, he was the golden goose.
Oh, yeah. But was he the same guy to you when you went to New York?
You know what? I don't think he could be because, Terry is a very quiet guy. And, I considered him a friend. I still do. I didn't expect any, big push or anything. All I wanted was an opportunity there, which I got. And I think the biggest thing that I noticed about him that he was in such demand that his life, was very compromised by the business. And, he more or less became his own little entity. I mean, they flew him around and, he didn't have to take the regular planes. They flew around him in, Lear jets, and he got picked up with limousines. And if he had to drive a car, he had a limousine. So, and then there was a few guys, that hung with him. Eddie Leslie was stuck on him like a bloodsucker, and then, which, was a good friend of his. And then Brian was a good friend of his, and it was just sort of hard because he sort of was segregated in the fact that, he was the golden goose. He stayed at a suite, and he stayed at a different hotel for, fan reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So, he became a little more far away in terms of, calling on the phone a glass of beer or wine with. So it was pretty hard for him to, mix in with the guys.
Yeah, like you said, for some reasons, definitely obvious.
Yeah.
But when you went, we started talking about New York, how did you make the jump to New York? Did you call them, or did they reach out to you, or how'd that go down?
Here's the deal. Because the AWA was drawing, the attendance was going down, the talent was down, and I had figured that I was worth something, in terms that I had been Greg's partner, off and on for 10 years. So I approached Vern, and I said, Vern, it's, and at this time, I'd had a gym for 3 years. It was called Jumpin Jim, Brunzell's gym, and it was a small gym, but, I needed to use some of my wrestling money to, help out making it go. And I went to Vern, and I said, Vern, I realize, things are down a little bit, but I really need a personal contract from you in order for me to be free, and to be able to concentrate on working, in the ring and not have all these other things to worry about. And he said, well, how much money do you want? And I said, well, I'd like to have a guaranteed contract of $95,000. And this was in 1985. And he told me right face to face, he says, you're not worth it. So I said, okay. So within 2 days, I'd called Hulk, and then George Scott, who was the booker, who actually fired me in 1981 down in North Carolina, or late 80, was the booker, and he said, hey, Jim, we'd love to have you, blah, blah, blah. I can't guarantee any big spot, but you'll be in the mix here, and you'll make X amount of dollars. So I called Greg, and I said, hey, I'm going to New York. And he said, oh, God, Jim, you can't. You're going to make a big mistake. And I said, Greg, I have no other choice. So I left and never looked back. And I remember it was June 26th, 1985, and I flew to New York, and then I got in a small plane, and the first guy I met from the WWF was Hillbilly Jim Morris, and we were on the small plane, and we flew to Poughkeepsie, New York, where we did our TV. And ever since then, Jim Morris and I have been exceptional friends. We call each other, a couple times a month, and, he's got his little Sirius satellite,
Outlaw Country there.
Yeah, and he's a great guy, and he was one of the really great guys as far as a friend that I met in New York.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, a few minutes ago, about teaming with Brian Blair.
Yes.
Can you tell about when they said, we want you guys to pair off, and ended up becoming the Killer Bees?
Well, Adam, originally I was hoping I wouldn't have to tag team there, because I had tag teamed almost my whole career, and I wanted to, just do stuff on my own like I did in the Mid-Atlantic. But I realized, hey, if they want to put us as a tag team, fine. You just had to roll with the waves, and they gave Brian and I a great gimmick. First of all, we were the Killer Bees, then we wore the yellow and black, striped tights, and then I really can't remember whose idea it was. It might have been Brian's, but because we were so close in size, I had longer legs, of course, but we were close in stature. We thought, well, we're going to have these masks, and we'll put these masks on when we get in trouble, and we'll use these masks just like the heel teams would, except we'll be baby faces. So we had one of the greatest baby face gimmicks ever, to use, and we could, and they didn't take advantage of it. Jesus, I remember in Buffalo, New York, we wrestled the Hearts, and they were the champions, and we beat them on TV with these masks, and the people went absolutely nuts, and they wouldn't let us keep the belt. So, from that point on, I realized that Vince really didn't have any plans for us, and, we were just one of the cogs that made the wheel go round. So that sort of, ate on us a lot because Brian and I, we worked extremely hard every match, and we had a lot of good matches. And it was you sort of had your slot there, and then you just said, well, this is where I'm going to be. And I'll tell you one time, Brian and I this was in '86, and Brian and I had been together almost a year, and they were going to open up Australia to the WWF. So Vince had us at TV, and he says, geez, I'd like to have you guys, do me a favor and go to Australia for 2 weeks and open up the country. And I says, oh, well, that sounds good. And at that time, Brian and I were making about $4,500 a week, which was great money. And so Vince said, well, here's the deal. He says, we're limited with the guarantee there, so I want you guys to go over there for $2,500 a week. And I stepped up and I said, Vince, I said, geez, I said, I understand. I said, but, as far as business is concerned, I'm making $4,500 now. I said, why would I want to go there and lose $4,000 in 2 weeks, to go to Australia? And he says, well, I understand. He says, but I'll guarantee you the next time you go, I'll make you $5,000 a week. So Brian and I said, okay, that's, we went. So we went over there and we worked with the Sheik and Nikolai, and Vince never booked us again in Australia. So we never did get, he got us there,
Yeah. Well, speaking of working Sheik and Volkov, your big crescendo was at WrestleMania 3 there.
Yeah.
Talk about working that event and something that huge in wrestling history.
Well, Adam, it was incredible because there were so many people there. I think people realized it was going to be big, but nobody realized it was going to be that big. And crikey, you had all the media there. God, they had people from CNN. They had people from Britain there. They had people, 2 different Japanese television studios. Australia was there. It was just huge. And the fact is that they had Brian and I again going against Nikolai and the Sheik right before Hulk and Andre came out. So the people were getting, antsy. They wanted to see the main event. And to be honest with you, the finish that they gave for Brian and I against Nikolai and the Sheik was so bad, it just made me sick because it was, and I realized they have to bring Jim Duggan into the situation. And, we had worked countless times with Nikolai and Sheik and had, pretty good matches. And to have Jim Duggan interfere in the match and then us to be happy that he interfered and we lose, the credibility of that finish was just horrible. And I thought, Jesus Christ, what is he trying to do here, So, the writing was on the wall there in terms of how they were going to use us. And we were fortunate, to have a good position, but, the finish of the match was horrible.
Now,
good for Jim Duggan, but not good for the Bees.
Yeah, that's true. Now, if I understand correctly, you actually witnessed that fight that's obviously talked about backstage from the backstage area with Adrian Adonis and Dan Spivey. Was that the case, and what actually happened?
Well, it was in Flint, Michigan, and Flint was a real rough town, and we were in a hockey arena there. So we were watching the matches, and Danny Spivey they'd brought him in, and he was working with Adrian Adonis, and Danny was pretty green, and Adrian would take what they'd call liberties with the young guys. He'd sort of be stiff with them and blah, 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 and kick them hard or hit them hard. And Danny Spivey was a tough son of a gun, boy.
Well, both guys were tough, we should say, but like you said, Adrian.
Yeah, Adrian was tough too, but Adrian, you got to realize, was about 45 pounds overweight. He really got out of shape, and what happened was he, was abusing Danny in the ring. So Danny said, "Hey, you do that again, I'm gonna let you have it." Well, in Flint, Adrian put the sleeper on Danny and started choking him. So Danny elbowed him, and when Adrian let loose, Danny Spivey clipped him, knocked him down, and then he kicked him. And Adrian went out like a light, and Jimmy Hart was, he looked like somebody cut his tail off. He didn't know what the hell to do. He was jumping up. His eyes looked like baseballs hanging out of his head. So we were standing back there, and I think Bob Orton went in to help Adrian, and they just rang the bell, and a couple of us got Danny Spivey back to the the babyface locker room, and Danny Spivey was just fuming. He said, "That son of a bitch, I told him blah, blah, blah." So meanwhile, Danny's in there, and then Adrian comes in, and Adrian's, he's got a cut over his forehead, and he's got, where he got kicked in the mouth, his lip is cut vertically, so he's bleeding. So Adrian comes in and he starts talking to Danny, and he tried to leg dive Danny, and Danny hit him with the biggest left uppercut I've ever seen. And he hit him right smack, I think it was on his, it was on his right cheekbone. And Adrian went up in the air about 1.5 feet and landed flat like a big turtle and didn't move. And he, Adrian's eyes went back, and then Danny Spivey wanted to kick him. He wanted to put the boots to him, and they finally, and Pat Patterson, who was the agent there, was just going crazy. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. Well, meanwhile, we get Adrian up to his feet, and Danny hit him so hard with that uppercut that his cheekbone was protruding through the flesh. You could see the shininess of his cheekbone. He had a big gash over his eye, and his lip was in two. So he got the shit beat out of him, and from that point on, Adrian was never the same. I think he never was the same in the ring.
Danny handled that?
Pardon?
Sorry, go ahead.
Adrian was never the same in the ring. I think he had, hurt his equilibrium, and I know he left and then, sort of straightened himself out and went to Japan, and then he came back from Japan, and that's when he was in the fatal car accident. But, we had lots of matches, Greg and I, with Adrian and Jesse. And Adrian, when he was lighter was, his timing in the ring was incredible. He was a great worker. But he just got so out of shape, and then he, abused himself so much that, with his habits, you can't do that and then expect to perform every night. It took its toll on him, and it was tragic, but I think that was what had happened when, guys are on the road every single night. They're in the bars, they're running around, they're in the bar every night, they're on an airplane every day, and you do that for a couple weeks straight, and some guys just can't take it, and they fly off the deep end.
Well, do you think, obviously, you hear about people taking advantage in the ring, more so in the older generations and whatnot, like you were saying, what Adrian was doing with Dan. But do you think Dan held it or did it right as far as doing some of the business in the ring as opposed to leaving everything in the back?
Well, I think that, he had more or less said to Adrian, please, he was trying to, say, I don't want you to take advantage of me, I'm going to work with you, blah, 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 but, don't, just go off and haul off and kick me and try to hurt me, because I won't take it. So I think that, Adrian just didn't think anything of it. He thought, well, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden, hell broke loose and he got shit beat out of him. As simple as that.
Yeah. Well, obviously, that type of thing happens. Because the reason I asked that question, that follow-up there, was because I always heard somebody who's pretty well respected by both the fans and the boys, Roddy Piper, always say, I always heard Roddy say when we spoke with him and in other avenues, as far as personal business. You do business in the ring and deal with the personal stuff in the back.
Well, that's true, but I think sometimes when a guy abuses you over and over again, and some guys just don't have a short fuse, and I think Danny was in that situation.
Well, here's the thing too. Have you ever had any issue with somebody trying to take advantage of you early on, or at any point in your career?
You know what? I was very fortunate. I never had. I don't think I ever had anybody. Some guys that hit you hard. Well, you just hit them, the same way. And I think if you didn't, tick for tat, then they would try to take advantage of you. But I was very fortunate, and I certainly was not a real tough guy. I didn't fight with anybody. I was doing my best every day just to, do the best I possibly could in the ring to get the match over. And, I can really honestly say I had very few fellows that I didn't, get along with. So
okay.
People didn't feel the same way about me, but that's the way I feel.
Well, if you don't mind, I actually took a couple fan questions from our social media outlets and whatnot. We'll wrap this up with 3 questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
First one is, taking yourself out of it, one fan asked, who do you think had the best drop kick in the business that you've seen?
Since I've left?
Or no, taking yourself out of it, because obviously you had a pretty good drop kick.
Yeah.
Leaving yourself out of it.
Yeah. I can't really tell you now, but I'll tell you who had a good drop kick and didn't use it much and could jump very well was Curt Hennig.
Yes.
Curt Hennig used to hold the guy by his hair and jump up and kick him in the chin. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Standing still.
Yeah. Curt could jump real good, and there was a lot of good. The timing is very important with the drop kick. You want to hit the guy at the height of your vertical leap. You don't want to drop kick him when you're down 4 feet in the air. You'd like to hit him when you're 6 feet up in the air, and consequently, I could do that. And the only thing, over a period of time, I ruined my shoulder. So I had a shoulder replacement a couple years ago, and that was a direct result of breaking a fall with my left forearm when I came down from the drop kick.
Yeah, because the other person that this fan who asked this question mentioned was, which I thought was pretty good as well, Rocky Johnson.
Yes.
As far as a drop kick.
Oh, you know what, Rocky, when I was with him, he was so heavy. Christ, he weighed about 265. I don't think he threw many drop kicks when I saw him in either Kansas City or Charlotte.
Yeah, but they were talking about, as far as total athleticism, like you mentioned with Curt Hennig there. Even though he was a bigger guy, he was a total athlete there too.
Well, he might have been, but I wasn't around to see it as much as, maybe it was in his earlier career. He's doing well now. His son is doing extremely well, so more power to him.
What did that son ever do with his,
Yeah.
The next question was, in your tag team career, was there a particular guy that you had more fun with and worked better with? Was it Blair or Gagne?
You know what? It was totally different. I mean, we both had good matches. I will just say that in the AWA, because of the situation, Greg being the son of the promoter, you always had a good match. And I think that in the WWF, you would work guys like, Bob Orton and Don Morocco hated to work with us. They just hated it. And consequently they wouldn't work as hard as they normally would, and they just went through the motions, and granted they were tired and depressed just like we were, and Vince hadn't done that much with them, etc. So, you can't blame them, but we had a lot of good men. I was extremely lucky, and I failed to mention my first tag team partner was Mike George in Kansas City in 1973, and we did very well together too. So I just wanted to mention him in there, but I was very fortunate that I had three really good partners, and in our time we did extremely well together.
Well, and the final question from the fans, which was an interesting one. It's actually a two-parter, and he was an older fan. Do you have any favorite memories of a Crusher? And of all the wrestlers that you haven't worked with, who would you like to work with, then or now?
Oh, geez. The Crusher, I can remember real quick. There was sort of a evening up in Lincoln, I think it was Lincoln, South Dakota, or Lincoln, North Dakota, and everybody was staying at the same hotel, and somehow or other there was sort of a water fight between the heels and the baby faces, and somebody had grabbed the Crusher's little Puerto Rican boot and was going to fill it full of water, and the Crusher had drank about 2 or 3 bottles of champagne, and he saw, I can't remember who the heel was, might have been Ray Stevens, and Ray was going to fill this probably $150 boot up with water, and Crusher, he had a cigar in his mouth, and he all of a sudden he just got completely out of character, and he says, "Ray, please don't do that." So that was a fun, it just sort of hit me funny, because everybody was drinking and having a good time, and then there was a water fight, and they were going to fill up his expensive boot with water and dump it on him, and he just got real normal. And probably the person that I would have really liked to work with would have been Jake Roberts. Even though Jake was a contemporary, I thought he was brilliant. He was the best worker, all-around worker, I think, in the WWF when I was there. I mean, Bob Orton was probably one of the best in the 70s, but that doggone Jake Roberts, his psychology, his timing, everything was just brilliant. And I would have loved, I made many trips with him. He used to ride with me when we do the Arizona and Washington and the California trip, but I would have loved to work with him. He was a real genius.
Yeah, it's a shame because he was someone who has, and granted, he's been doing great recently thanks to Diamond Dallas Stage.
Yep.
But the thing with Jake Roberts that we always heard on the positive side, and you mentioned it there, was he always had a good mind for the business and could have been probably one of the best agents currently now in the product.
I agree.
Well, obviously, again, as we mentioned at the beginning of this, Jumpin Jim Brunzell is going to be winning the Frank Gotch Award at the Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa this weekend, the 12th and the 13th. Congratulations on the award, and keep us posted if anything new's coming on, Jim.
Okay, Adam. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the interview. Take care.
All right. Have a good night.
Yep. Bye.